actually help students use access the native speakers. And the other one, of course, and I will describe that in detail later, tends to be, especially with the rise of social media, associated with the use of technology. To the extent that in some cases, some people even argue not to forbid the use of some types of social media abroad, at least during some time. And as I said, the opposite has been the case for learners in studiable settings, where these internet-based tools seem to disrupt the opportunities for interaction with the local use of the language native speakers. Now, this is a very rough and brief history of social media. I would say that in the 1990s into the early 2000s, the internet email was essentially the main source of communication, social communication, aided by technology. Eventually, of course, we have the usual suspects here, Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, etc., which in the mid-2000s started to become popular, and nowadays they're everywhere. And obviously, students who are abroad are very well versed in using this media, and they use it. So let's take a look at the main argument behind the limitation of uses of this media abroad, or why they're perceived as a challenge, a threat to learning the language in the studiable context. Essentially, the idea is that there is an explicit assumption, which is mentioned everywhere, as I mentioned before, the idea that it detracts from the desired total immersion setting of most studiable programs. But there is another factor here, which is a hidden factor, an implicit one, which is this monoglossic view of language. In other words, the L1 and the L2 are not to meet at any point in time. They have to be separated. And this is, of course, a definition of language, and beyond that, a linguistic ideology. So I'll be touching on these issues. And essentially, by looking at this conundrum about the use of the L1 and the use of technology, I'm going to try to connect those two and look at resources in general. So, despite these negative components of the use of the L1 social media, there are some positive aspects. And there are some studies which have looked at this in terms of the emotional support that the students can have in these type of programs. And again, this is based on a number of studies looking at actual empirical data. There's also the notion of strategic functional allocation, and we'll come back to these issues later. McManus et al., for example, talk about the idea that you can contain, you can limit the use of the social media to certain environments, and then not allow those uses in other settings. And this is one study which actually looked at that, at least the conclusion was that that was what was going on with these students abroad. And finally, the issue of matching the social construct. If you go abroad and the native speakers are already integrated, the use of social media into their normal interactions, that is a construct. So you need to match the social construct. It is kind of naive to say that you're not going to use those resources when in fact they're already part of the goal that you have to achieve, the ability to communicate in those other communication modes. There are other arguments, which I'm not going to discuss today, but here you have a couple of useful resources to review those. So we need to try to build a theoretical model. I'm going to start looking at a couple of options: language as interaction and resources for interaction. So the first one is the notion of interaction. So the social term, which happened in the early 2000s, is really coming late, so to speak. There is a textbook, well, actually, a book, I think, I don't know what you want to call it, by Jack Richards from the 80s, where, for example, he talks in detail about the distinction between transactional and interactional language. So this is not new. In the 80s, it was already being discussed as a matter of training for teachers. So the idea that we expand the definition of language, and really we have now two distinct constructs. One of them is communicative competence as we used to understand it before, transactional, and the other one is interaction. Now, of course, we need to define in a little bit more detail what interaction means. So you have here one major point of reference. People have been working on this topic, who describe it as the ability to enact social roles. So this is going beyond just the transaction of communication. And of course, it requires social, pragmatic, cultural knowledge to understand other social action. This is broadening substantially the objective of the construct. Also, I should mention here, since we're talking about resources, something which is becoming more and more prevalent in discussions lately, which is the idea of embodiment of language. So we have the example of gestures, gaze, positional bodies. In other words, linguistic information is not just contained on vocabulary, syntax, etc. It goes beyond that. So the resource for interaction. Here we have another of those terms, the multilingual term. The idea here is that we're not looking at monolingual learners. We know this, it's obvious, it's in our face. Really the idea that we're going from the L1 to the L2. And again, the separation of these entities, which obviously we have the notion of the multilingual. And when we're talking about someone who is a learner, obviously there is a mixing. If we're going to call it that way, it's a loaded word, I'll use it anyway. And we have, of course, the notion of translanguage, which I find very useful. It does not replace the notion of code switching, which is very well established in social linguistics. Some people tend to view it that way. Even the authors who support translanguage sometimes go in that direction. I think it's not the same. And as I mentioned here, it is really an educational political goal what translanguage has in mind. It really builds on code switching. There's no contradiction really in terms of position. And even if we go to the origin of the word translanguage, it comes from Welsh, and actually it was actually coded or first used in order to rescue a minority language. So the idea here was to use more than one language and actually to have this code switching going on. Now, beyond these basic notions in terms of theoretical background, we also need to take a look at some components of this challenge that I just described before. So I'm going to look at three items here, social networks. I'm going to go back to time and task, and finally the most important one, which is features of language and media. First of all, the social networks idea, which in a way is behind, even for people who are not well versed in the literature, they're still making reference to this idea, which is the connection with native speakers and users of the language is what actually prompts development in DL2. Now, the issue here is that in some cases, learners who did not develop the social networks actually achieve success. So you have this old study, very large study from Rivers, where she realized that the students increased their proficiency despite not really having a lot of interaction and really just be sitting into themselves and just watching news, reading newspapers. Another study which actually looked at social networks, Salaberry Garcia, also found out the same thing. Now the answer to this is actually very simple. What they tested is not really what they were looking for. So they were really testing communicative competence, and that's why these students succeed. So it's really an artifact of the study. It's a research design issue, which really raises an important issue in terms of previous studies and future studies and how they're designed to find out whether you're actually reaching the goal that you're trying to achieve. Also, there are some other questions. Gautier and Chevreul, for example, lay out the picture of something very complex. We don't really quite understand exactly how social networks work and what exactly we can achieve. So it's premature sometimes to say, I'm going to look for social networks, first order, second order relationships, and sometimes we don't really know what's going on here. Something to keep in mind, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do the research, actually we should, but we should be humble about what we can achieve in those studies. And also the fact that new social media are making these connections much more complex. It's not just about tracking whether you have French friends now with the soccer team you're playing with. This is the old studies from the early 2000s. Now those interactions happen in many different ways, which are aided by social media. And finally, even when we understand this complex idea, we also have to apply, and that there is going to be a distance between these two components. Time on task, again, these are the two major components. The idea that more time on task is better. I mean, there's no question about that. No one's going to reject that option. There's a conceptual factor that I mentioned before. Now, keeping this in mind, there are a number of questions about time on task. The first one is that this, I would call it an illusion of complete immersion, is not really true. We have the old studies from Wilkinson, who did discourse analysis of students in France in this case, in which she essentially discovered that students were not really interacting with people. Even though they looked on the surface, even though the program was built, was sold as such, and many study programs, I mean, almost all of them really are sold as such, they really don't achieve those goals is more of an illusion, as I said before. So even when we talk about kind of tasks, we have to be aware that maybe this is not something that we can actually implement. And also we have the idea that technology has not changed the nature of the learning process. It is the ever-present use of social networking sites, which is now bringing to the forefront of our attention the idea that there were some opportunities that already existed before. It's not really changing the nature of the learning process. And of course, with a clear understanding of the dynamics of these interactions, we have the option to manage those opportunities and also to take advantage of them. And this is the opportunity that we have here. Now, there are a number of coding features of media. So when we select a particular medium of communication, we make decisions. We make split-second decisions sometimes based on functional goals, based on what the medium will bring me. And I always like to study from Clark and Brennan from '91, who essentially laid out a number of these factors. It's not, it's a non-exclusive list, but you can see here, and you can already start to connect. This is '91, remember. You can start to connect already how useful this could be when we look at social media or any type of communication media. It's actually relevant for any kind of communication media. You can look at just oral and written communication and telephone in the middle if you want to add that in the 1990s, early 1990s. And it will work with that setup, and it will also work with any setup we have with social media technology. Now, I don't know if Paige actually reviewed, I checked, I don't remember now whether she checked Clark and Brennan, but she certainly is making reference to the same idea. And this is very, very positive, in my view, in the sense that we are aware of these issues. So Paige talked about multimodality. I mean, this is a very late, very contemporary article, which of course is focused on social media. Multimodality, immediacy, co-construction, embeddedness. These are the factors that allow people, again, in many cases in an unconscious way, sometimes conscious, about what medium to use, and whether I want to have visual information being conveyed or not, whether I don't want to have that, whether I don't want to have the immediate reaction. If you use WhatsApp, you know that the check mark is received, the double check is they read. I mean, some people keep track of those things. I do. These new social media are not changing the nature of the process that Clark and Brennan described before, but they're really broadening, expanding the options that you now have. So Clark and Brennan didn't even have in mind what's happening right now, which is much more, gives you many more opportunities. So what do we need to know at this point? We'll go back again to the building the model slide, but let me stop for a second just to review things we need to know. We need to know how different linguistic resources work together. So we have one study from Ilola and Scott who look at blogs. Now, of course, many of these studies become dated very quickly. 2008 already is 10 years ago. That's ages. My kids were 4 or 5. Right now they're teenagers. So social media goes along with that trend of very fast movement. You also have the issue of how technology brings up this notion of multilingual identity ability, and Andrus talks about network multilingualism in Facebook. And I should mention, by the way, I've been to some presentations. There are discussions about WhatsApp. Ganzu, I think, is the Chinese word for relationships, and how those WeChat moments are assessed in that study. The Facebook analysis that I saw yesterday too, the idea of synchronous, asynchronous affordances, all those options are being studied, and many of those studies are being presented at this conference, I should say, which is very encouraging because this is the kind of research that we need. And finally, we have the notion of how do we teach this integrated view of language abilities, interactional, and linguistic resources. So this is a challenge, but of course it's a good challenge, meaning that we have a number of options to address these issues. So let me go back to those issues again. I want to finish up this notion of how this model can be built. So the goal here, in a way, for the talk is interaction with companies abroad, but obviously I'm not talking just about abroad, I'm talking about interaction with companies in any kind of setting. Of course, each setting is different and requires different treatment, but overall we're talking about the same issue. So these are some of the positive aspects I mentioned before. So let me review them again, because I think they are not as ambitious enough as they should be. I think we can broaden it a little bit, and let me explain how we can do that. First of all, the notion of emotional support. And again, these are kind of short-term solutions. So we allow the use of social media, L1, all these different resources in certain settings, emotional support. I think we can broaden that. We can have a holistic view of language and language use, and that means using all these resources anytime that they're needed. If there is a functional need for that, we should use it. We should allow students to use it. Strategic functional allocation, this could be a semantics issue, but I think based on the study that I mentioned before, McManus, the idea of strategic, meaning limitation of those resources of L1, technology, etc., to just some situation should not be limited. In other words, we should talk about functional allocation. Now, for some people, strategic functional allocation is the same, which is fine, again, but the point here is that you should not be limited to certain environments strategically chosen. And finally, of course, contract matching. The idea that interaction with competence, in this case, is no longer communicative, transactional competence, but now we're talking about embodying multimodal, multilingual, translingual construct. So where do we go from here? The integrated study about context, and again, this could be expanded to at-home context as well, with some qualifications, some caveats, etc. Presents learners with an ecologically valid, realistic view of linguistic cultural interactions in study settings, as opposed to the compartmentalized view of the monoglossic linguistic ideologies of the past. A new type of social interaction literacy, I mentioned the Clark and Brennan, Page, etc., where we integrate the use of both virtual and physical interaction. These are no longer one or the other. They're both. They're hybrid. They can no longer be extricated from each other. And finally, a broader focus that goes beyond the use of logistical opportunities to expand the world of social interaction in the L2, and looking into the redefinition of language, identity, learning. And if that is not clear enough, we should also be looking at an evolving definition of language ideology. And with that in mind, very broad, very ambitious. I'm going to stop here and I'll wait for some questions for the session. Thank you.
Any questions?
Stuck to 20 minutes sharp, just to leave time for questions. You can attack the talk if you want, that's fine too.
Perhaps I can ask you
Sure.
a question about the use of the word multimodality, because I consider it as a better word than virtual, meaning that it contains in its essence, in my view, but not all authors use the word in the same acceptance, meaning that multimodality shows that there are more modes of communication, more modes of interaction than reality. The technology allows us more affordance to use the word.
Yeah.
What was your exact definition of what multimodality? Was it that meaning, or do you see it only as image, sound, or is it also about global, remote, synchronous, asynchronous? How do you see it?
I would say all of the above, meaning if I go back again to the notion from Zuckerberg and Page, others who have looked at this, there are a number of criteria we can use to define or to understand how different media, different resources allow you to communicate with others. So there could be modes of communication which we are not even aware of that are invented in the future. Those should be analyzable with this type of framework that has existed for a long time. And there are many examples in the past where we can look at previous technologies which failed. And the reason they failed is because people were not paying attention to these different coding criteria. The video phone, which was invented by AT&T many years ago, before it was even a reality in terms of commercial possibility, At one point, people thought that this is the end of traveling around the country to do business. Later on, they realized, wait a minute, even in the US, I should say, much of the business is not done during the PowerPoint presentation. It's actually done over lunch, over dinner, over meetings, etc. So they realized, no, this is not going to end that. And this is an example of how you need to pay attention to this coding criteria to understand what the affordances are of those technologies. And any new technology should be analyzable from that point of view. So I guess I'm saying that I agree with you, even going beyond that.
Any other question?
Yes, thank you for your very nice presentation. You have been looking at L1, L2 interaction, right? But I would like to ask you whether you consider the third language coming into that interaction between those two languages, because in my experience and what I see around me and international students is that they look for each other, so in an international setting. So they are not looking maybe for the native speaker, but they are looking for international students with whom they share the same reality, right? They are abroad, and it is a new context, a new situation, a new experience, a very enriching one. And what I would say is that the intercultural aspect is really very rich in this context, okay? So they don't just learn about the L2 culture and linguistic issues, but they also learn about the situation in Canada, in Africa, in Asia. I don't know whether you have been looking at this interaction between the three.
Yeah, and I've been working on all three. So I see two issues behind your question, and maybe I'm appropriating your question and maybe going in a different direction. I don't know. You tell me if I address your question or not that way. The first issue is that I've been using this conundrum about the use of the L1 as an excuse, really, to talk about the linguistic resource, L1 being one of those. That's why the social media technology is another resource. Embodiment of language is another resource. All those are resources. So really, I use an excuse to go into something broader. And obviously, then you bring up another issue, which is not just the resources, it's the objectives. So we've been talking for a while about the illusion of the native speaker, who is the native speaker, right? So that may not be the goal. So what is the goal? In some cases, the goal is not really the old-fashioned view of language, which is this circumscribed notion of the syntax and the vocabulary for this particular standard language, which is an illusion, which is anyway. But then now we have an objective, which is bringing in another language and being multilingual, and being able to use multilinguistic resources. So this is what translingual is about. Translingual is about studying, if you look at Maria Garcia, what she's done, it's about giving power to learners who have been told that they speak neither this language nor that language. So what are they? The non-use of language. And in reality, they use resources in different ways. There could be a third language thrown into that equation, and that works perfectly fine, a fourth language, etc. All those are different resources that are combined. So it's not just the resources, now we're also talking, if I can appropriate your question, thinking of the version of objectives. What do the learners want to do? And there's a lot of issues in terms of research now, in terms of identity, in terms of multilingualism, which could be part of the picture. It's much more ambitious, much more difficult to approach, but to some extent you have to acknowledge that may be the goal, more realistic goal.
Okay, thank you for your very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
Now it's time to move on to the
If I can just mention one more thing, we have a conference coming up, 2020. Call for papers deadline is December 1st. It is related to the topic of the conference here, so if you're interested, if anyone else is interested, you can go to our webpage and all the information is there. Thank you.